State Chamber of Oklahoma's Business Roundtable, presented by Cox Communications. And now, here's your host, Fred Morgan.
Hello and welcome to the State Chamber of Oklahoma's Business Roundtable. We have partnered with Cox Communications to tell stories about businesses in Oklahoma and to discuss business issues. And with the recently completed federal tax cut, we have a lot of things to talk about for what opportunities might be there for Oklahoma. This was the largest tax cut in history, and it could present a lot of opportunities for Oklahoma business. And we have as our guest today Cheryl Denney, who is with the law firm of McAfee and Taft. Cheryl, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
We've known each other for a long time. Tell our viewers a little bit about you and your education, where you got your law school, where you went to law school, and your family, and all that.
Absolutely. Well, I was raised in Durant, or Durant, if you want me to put the accent back on. Went to undergrad at Oklahoma Baptist University. My father's a Southern Baptist minister, so kept it in the denomination there. And then after undergrad, I worked for a few years at the state capitol in politics.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
What did you do there?
I was on Senate staff,
Okay.
and then was a legislative secretary in the House for Jerry Askins and Debbie Blackburn when they were freshman legislators.
I'll be darned. Okay.
So then I decided to go to law school, and went to law school at Georgetown Law in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
Ran up way too much law school debt, and so took a job out of law school in New York City, made some money, paid back some debt, worked way long hours, lost a lot of sleep, and then in 2003 it was time to come home.
All right. Well, you and I have worked together both, I think, as lawyers and as in the political front, but did you start out with, what are your areas of practice? Let me just ask it that way.
Yeah, it's been an interesting ride. So I started out when I was in New York City, and it was general corporate and mergers and acquisitions. I was never really interested in being a litigator, so I never went down that path. I was always interested in the business side of law. And then when I came back to Oklahoma, was hired by McAfee and Taft, great firm, and when they hired me, they didn't really know what to do with me. And so I was like, great, I'm gonna be able to coast for a few months and kind of relax and recover from New York City. And I walked in the first day, and there was a stack of papers on my desk about this tall, and there was a note on it from one of the senior partners, and it only had one word. It said, learn. And that was my introduction into tax credits, because a new tax credit and tax incentive had been just recently passed, and some of our clients had received an allocation. It was called the New Market Tax Credit. So that was in 2003. So I learned very quickly, and on December 31st of 2003, closed one of the first New Market Tax Credit deals in the country.
All right.
Yeah. In Durant, no less.
And I know you've done a lot of work, especially with the City of Oklahoma City and the Oklahoma City Chamber, on some of the big economic development deals in our history. Talk about a few of those things that you've worked on.
Absolutely. Economic development is a great area. You get to be involved in some really exciting projects, and I love being involved locally, because now with kids I get to drive around Oklahoma City and point to buildings and businesses that I had a small part in. And one of those that I think you're probably referring to was I had the pleasure of working with Oklahoma City Thunder organization when they were relocating to Oklahoma City, and working at the city level and the state level to help get some of the incentives that drew them to Oklahoma City. So that was a great experience, once in a lifetime.
Yeah. You mentioned kids. You have children.
I do. I have 3 kids. I have a 17-year-old stepdaughter who lives in Milwaukee, and we're just about through the teenage years with her, so that's good. And then I have a 10-year-old and 8-year-old daughter who live with us in Choctaw and go to Choctaw Public Schools and are anxiously awaiting summertime.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let me talk about, in your experience in economic development, how important are tax incentives and tax credits to getting businesses to expand or relocate here?
They're incredibly important. I mean, the breadth and the number of projects that I have worked on has really exhibited that fact to me. One of the really great projects and very interesting projects we're working on now is with Gary Brooks and the First National Center. And there are a lot of projects like that one that are really important to a community, but really couldn't go forward without some help. Because the cost to rehabilitate a historic building, the Skirvin Hotel was the same situation, and I worked on that project too. It's really just, you need a little help, and the government steps in through historic rehab credits and other incentives and city incentives to provide that help to accomplish things that are really important to the community. Some other ones have been more business oriented or not-for-profits. Variety Care is a great organization that provides health care for low-income individuals and others. And they've used tax credits and tax incentives to build 2 new clinics in Oklahoma City to really help expand their service and their footprint and provide those services. And then businesses, that a couple of them recently were looking at relocating to a different state. We were able to bring some incentives to the table and keep those jobs here. So incredibly, incredibly important.
Yeah. We have to fight this battle at the state legislature all the time.
We
and
do.
You know from your personal experience, there's always a lot of skepticism to giving tax credits or tax incentives to a particular business or to a particular industry. But it sounds like from your personal experience, some of these deals would not happen.
Absolutely. I have the pleasure of reading 100-page plus financial projections and seeing all the behind the curtains. And some of the projects just don't make sense economically. You have an appraisal that says the business in this facility as a going concern is going to be worth $30 million. Well, it's going to cost $50 million to rehabilitate the building. And so somebody's got to make up the difference. And that's not First National Center, by the way. Those numbers are even larger.
Yeah. Well, and I know, some of these things, there are 2 things that I always try to talk about. One is, it's important to preserve our culture, like
Absolutely.
the Skirvin Hotel. And there's a sense of community around some of those historic tax credits programs. But there's also the additional private investment that comes once the public commits dollars. There's also other dollars.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the projects we worked on last year, they were looking to get some private equity investors to come in to help expand a business. They needed to buy some more manufacturing equipment to be able to expand and produce more goods, and they thought they had the market for it. But the private equity investors weren't so sure. So bringing some tax credits to the table to help offset some of the cost of that new equipment really kind of put them over the top and allowed those private equity investors to come in and help expand the business even further than we could have done with just the tax incentives.
Good. It's good to hear from an expert. We're going to take a break now, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the new federal tax law.
Yes, yes.
Right, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back with Cheryl Denney as our guest. Welcome back to our conversation with Cheryl Denney, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the new big federal tax law. That was, my understanding, the largest tax cut in history of the United States. So tell us a little bit about it and tell us how you're involved with it.
Absolutely. Well, I can tell you, last fall I was really worried because talk of the tax reform, and there was a lot of discussion about terminating some of the programs that have been so helpful to Oklahoma and that I work with a lot. I had conversations with my husband. What am I going to do? Do I need to find a new practice area? And he rightfully said, calm down. It takes a lot to change things in Washington. So I did calm down. Most of the programs that we use here in Oklahoma survived the tax cuts and the tax reform. And the big surprise in January after it passed was that we got a new tax incentive tool to use across the country, not just in Oklahoma, but it was very quietly done. As you can imagine, being a practitioner in this industry, I listen to a lot and read a lot within the industry, and I'm kind of a nerd, so I listen to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast. And there was no discussion of this tax incentive at all leading up to tax reform. And then in January, it was like, here's a late Christmas present, another economic development tool for the toolkit for people like the Chamber and the Commerce Department as to put to use in Oklahoma.
Tax reform in D.C. happens, true tax reform, they're always tweaking it, but
Right.
It really only happens about once every generation, doesn't it?
If that,
Yeah.
if that. So it was very significant, and we're still trying to figure out a lot of the implications of the law that was passed and waiting on a lot of federal regulations that are still to come.
All right. And the new, well, let me start by asking you, what's the difference for our viewers? What's the difference between a tax incentive and a tax incentive and a tax cut.
And a tax cut.
Yeah. Or a tax credit.
A tax credit, yeah, both. Tax cut is based on the rate that you have, and the rates come down, and we all pay fewer taxes, and that's generally considered a good thing. A tax credit typically allows you to offset your tax liability. So if you have $100 that you owe the federal government, and you have, through your efforts in rehabilitating a historic building, have a historic tax credit of $20, then it decreases your tax liability dollar for dollar. So instead of owing the federal government $100, you owe them $80. Right. Tax incentives is a broader term, and in the context of this opportunity zone incentive that we're going to talk about, it allows you to defer gain from other activities. So if you own Microsoft stock, and you decide to sell that stock and you have a $100 gain on the stock that you would normally pay tax on, if you invested in a low-income community using this opportunity zone incentive, you're able to defer that tax for up to 9 years.
And that's called an opportunity zone.
It's a term that's led to some confusion, right, because it's a great term, and there's lots of opportunity things in the federal government, and opportunity zones have been used in other programs, so it caused some confusion when it first came out. This is a brand new program.
Right. I think there are already some opportunity zones around,
right,
but
and
this is
enterprise zones and empowerment zones and every kind of great phrase you can think of.
I learned a little bit about this, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is actually, I think, really taking a strong look at this and are actually encouraging companies. But let's talk about, first of all, what is an opportunity zone and how many does Oklahoma have?
Right. So the opportunity zones are low-income communities, and they are determined on a census tract by census tract basis. So there are people in the government who have looked at every census tract in the United States and what the poverty rate is and what the unemployment rate is and the area median income, and come up with this definition of a low-income census tract. So in Oklahoma, we have 465 low-income census tracts. Now, a census tract is kind of difficult to understand because in an urban area like Oklahoma City, a census tract might be a block. Right. In western Oklahoma, it might be square miles. Right. So it's a little bit difficult, but there's 465 in Oklahoma. Opportunity zones were created, and basically they said the governor of each state is allowed to designate 25% of its low-income census tracts as opportunity zones. So in Oklahoma, we have 117.
Okay, so there are a total of 460-something census tracts, and
that
of
could,
those,
we're eligible for designation.
Well, how many tracts are there in the entire state? Approximately.
I don't know.
It's a very small. That's a very small
it's a very
percentage.
Small. Yeah, okay. Across the country, it's about 10% of census tracts. I don't know the Oklahoma number, but across the country, about 10% of census tracts are considered low income, and about 30 million people in the United States live in a low income census tract.
Wow. Okay. So, tell us how it works.
So, it was passed, as we said, with tax reform, and the governor of each state got to designate 25% of their qualified low-income census tracts to be opportunity zones. Okay. The reason there was a big push, and the chambers and the mayoral conferences and stuff were talking about it, is that the governors had to make that designation by March 21st. So there was a very big push to kind of get everyone around the table, and I have to give a lot of credit to the Oklahoma Department of Commerce here and John Chappie and his team there. They did a great job of getting the word out to all the cities and the mayors to try to figure out within their jurisdictions which census tracts would be good to be designated as opportunity zones.
Okay. Well, we need to take another break,
Sure.
but we're going to come back and talk about how this will actually work and how businesses might take advantage of it.
Awesome.
Okay.
Great.
So come back and join us as we continue our conversation with Cheryl Denney of McAfee and Taft. Welcome back to our discussion about the new federal tax law and the big changes. So, Cheryl, before the break, we're talking about the fact that the governor and the Department of Commerce have designated some of these opportunity zones within the state of Oklahoma.
Right.
Okay, so now what
do we do now?
Yeah, what do we do now?
So we met the March 21st deadline, and so now investors are starting to look at how we might use this new incentive in Oklahoma. And it's going to take a while to figure out. I mentioned earlier, we're waiting on some federal regulations to come down to help explain the program. The IRS has said that they are hoping to issue those by June 30. Much of my experience with those regulations is probably not going to be by June 30, but they're doing their best. They've got a lot of work to do. So we know the bare bones of the program because that was included in the statute. And so how it works is we're going to have opportunity zone funds, which will be kind of conduit investment entities that will make
what does that mean?
A conduit. It means it's an entity that someone makes an investment through.
Okay.
So this opportunity zone fund is not really going to use its own money. It's going to use somebody else's money to flow through the opportunity zone fund to then make an investment in a low-income community. So I'll give you an example. That's probably the best way to understand it. So if going back to my Microsoft stock example, if I sold shares of Microsoft stock and I had $100 of gain, in a normal scenario, I'd pay tax on that gain and then take what's left over and go and invest that in the stock market probably and make money on that. However, if I wanted to, now with the opportunity zone funds, I could take that $100 before I pay any tax on it and invest it in an opportunity zone fund. The fund would then take my $100 and make an investment into a low-income community business. That's a business that's located in a low-income community, or into some property that might be located in a low-income community. And because I've decided to do good with my money, the result is I get 3 benefits from that. So the first benefit, the immediate benefit, is that $100, rather than having to pay tax on it immediately, I get to defer that tax for up to 9 years. So to December 31st of 2027. 2026, sorry, I knew I had to write that down for some reason. So that's the first gain, that's the first benefit, that's the immediate benefit. The second benefit is if I hold that investment in the low-income community for 5 years, then 10% of the gain that I would have paid is kind of wiped out. So ultimately when I pay that gain, I paid less. When I paid that tax on the gain, I paid less.
Right.
If I hold that investment for 7 years, an additional 5% is wiped out. So if you hold a longer term investment, you pay less on taxes when you ultimately pay
20% less.
15, yeah,
15%.
10 and 5.
10 and 5, okay.
Yeah. And then the third benefit is that investment in the Opportunity Zone Fund, if I hold it for more than 10 years, then ultimately when I do sell it, I don't pay tax on the gain from that investment.
Okay.
So that for long-term investors
Wow.
and family offices and people who are looking for generational planning can be really, really significant.
So who administers these Opportunity Zone funds?
So it's the IRS through the Treasury Department, and that's the first round of regulations that we're expecting is probably going to tell us how you form those funds. They have to be certified by the federal government, so there's going to be a process that you go through, but there's no limit. And
But this could be like a hedge fund or anybody, but it's going to be private sector driven.
It could be private sector driven, and we're anticipating a lot of that. It could be public sector driven. I think Oklahoma City and Tulsa are looking at potentially having Opportunity Zone funds that are city sponsored, not for profits who operate in the new market tax credit space that I mentioned earlier. They're looking at being duly certified as an Opportunity Zone fund, so potentially an investor could get both the Opportunity Zone incentive and the new market tax credit on the same dollar.
I see,
Yeah.
I see. And another benefit, you mentioned the 3 benefits, but the other benefit is actually doing good for their community, helping neighborhoods recover, helping people gain job opportunities as well.
Absolutely,
So.
absolutely. That can't be understated.
Yeah. So what else, so how do you see this working?
It's going to be really interesting. I mean, the tax credits that we deal with here in Oklahoma, there's 3 primary varieties. The new market tax credit that I mentioned, which is a business-oriented tax credit, low-income housing tax credit, which has been around a long time, and historic rehab tax credits. Now, the interesting thing about this Opportunity Zone incentive is that it can be combined with any of those tax credits, as I mentioned, to get both benefits on the same dollar. So you can imagine how that just leverages the benefit that you're getting. So I anticipate that people who are active in those markets are going to try to do projects more. It's going to drive more investment into the opportunity zones because it helps make up that gap that we were talking about earlier a lot more easily.
And I know we have in Oklahoma City and in Tulsa, I'm sure as well, that there are areas where private sector investors just have not invested, whether it's high crime, whether it's decrepit infrastructure, they just haven't invested. Are you hoping this will spur economic development in those areas?
Absolutely, and one of the tools that local cities like Oklahoma City and Tulsa and others use to help address some of those problems are tax increment finance districts. And so in looking at where we wanted to designate opportunity zones, I know both Oklahoma City and Tulsa looked at where their TIF districts are to try to designate those areas as opportunity zones and be able to drive even more investment into those areas.
Wow, sounds exciting.
It's going to be fun.
We need to take a final break,
Okay.
and then we'll come back with a few thoughts from Cheryl Denney of McAfee and Taft on the new federal tax law. Come back and join us. Welcome back to our discussion on the new tax law, the federal tax law. Cheryl, are there any limits on this new opportunity zone?
That's one of the really exciting things about this incentive and the way it's designed. New market tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, those are appropriated by Congress every year. So there is a limit to how many of those come into the market, and Oklahoma being a lower population state than some of the others sometimes doesn't get as many of those types of incentives. This one's not limited. The people who are out there say that there's $6 trillion worth of capital gain that if it were sold, the Microsoft stock example, could be put to work in low-income communities, and that's exciting.
Wow. Where are some of the opportunity zones in the Tulsa and Oklahoma City metros?
Sure. So we worked with Oklahoma City and a little bit with Tulsa, and as I said, Commerce Department did a great job coordinating with all the cities. In Oklahoma City, they focused on the TIF districts, like I mentioned, so Northeast Oklahoma City. A lot of that is designated as an opportunity zone. They also focused a lot on other projects that the city has ongoing, like the Innovation District is now going to be an opportunity zone. The AICCM, the American Indian Cultural Center, is going to be an opportunity zone, or has been designated. In Tulsa, they're doing a lot of development along the river, so they use that, and then out by the Tulsa airport. And then both cities, of course, their central business districts are significantly now also designated as opportunity zones.
Do you think that more of these opportunities will be seized by the private sector or by, as you said, like economic development of Oklahoma City or the Oklahoma City Chamber?
I'm hoping that a lot of these will be seized by the private sector because they're the ones that are going to be realizing the capital gains and hopefully can decide to put those back into the low-income communities. I also think the not-for-profit sector is going to really benefit from these because they might have donors that are going to have gains that be realized and already have a relationship with the not-for-profit and would be happy to put the gains into a specific not-for-profit.
And do you think that the public sector is, I know you said you've been speaking a lot on this topic. I assume that's one of the reasons is because a lot of people don't know much about it.
That's right, and the mayors and the chambers and really the local officials are carrying the flag. One of the key people who helped pass this was Senator Booker, and he was quoted in an article just this week saying this was the best kept secret in Washington because it's really the local people across the country who are carrying the flag.
Okay. Have you started visiting with interested parties?
Absolutely, my phone's ringing off the hook.
Oh, well, that's great.
So it's gonna be interesting, and some of the projects, you might have been reading in the paper about the Armory and some of the plans that have been put on the table to redevelop that. And that's within an opportunity zone, and we're hoping that might be the first project.
Well, Cheryl, thanks for being here today. This is an exciting new time.
Yes, yes, it is, and I still have a job.
Well, thank you for being here with us today,
Thank you.
We may want to bring you back and talk about how this all develops over the future. So,
That'd be great.
All right. We hope you will come back and join us the next time for our next show as we continue to talk about businesses around the state. Thank you.
Thank you for watching the State Chamber of Oklahoma's Business Roundtable, presented by Cox Communications. If you have questions about this program, email the Chamber at okstatechamber.com. Set furnishings provided by Scott Rice. creating effective workspace from the floor to the ceiling and everything in between.